Assalamualaikum to Sehaji Wahi. My name is Nur Shazun Safwana binti Omar. I am a final year business economics student. Thank you very much indeed for watching this video of presentations which will be explained and described about my study entitled The Relationship Between Happiness and Economic Development in Malaysia. Introduction. This study aims to examine the impact of happiness on the economic development in Malaysia from year 1988 until 2018. The dependent variable would be the economic development and independent variable would be happiness. Based on the previous literature of relationship between happiness and economic development is uncertain. Some agree there is positive relationship between the variable and some equally have contradictory results. According to a study by Graham and Pettinato, there is negative relationship between happiness and economic development, while Abdelati and Noureddin stated that there is positive relationship between happiness and economic development. Research objective for this study is divided into two, which is general objective and specific objective. The general objective is to examine the impact of happiness and economic development in Malaysia. As for the specific objective is to determine the relationship between education and GDP growth, to verify the relationship between GDP PC and GDP growth, and lastly is to identify the relationship between unemployment and GDP growth. Therefore, based on the research objectives, the research questions is there any relationship between happiness and economic development in Malaysia? Significance of the study is to provide comprehension into the way in which in a country to appraise their own well-being and how their evaluations can provide common conclusions for solutions in economic issue. Moreover, it is to help the development economists and practitioners to improve their benchmark in determining progress and for the betterment for more smooth economic progress. Move on to the literature review. The term of happiness is frequently used interchangeably with life satisfaction, and it is subjective well-being as well as quality of life according to Campfield. While economic development, according to Kathina and Shivani, it can be described as an increase in the output of the economy to generate goods and services, contrasted from one period to another over a period. Hypothesis statements. For hypothesis 1, this is about the relationship between education and GDP growth. Second hypothesis is the relationship between GDP per capita and GDP growth. And lastly, the relationship between unemployment and GDP growth. As you can see, this figure shows the conceptual framework for this study. Specifically, this study will identify the relationship between economic development using the GDP annual percent and happiness using unemployment, education, and GDP per capita as a proxy for happiness. Method of data analysis. This study are using the augmented Dickey-Fuller, Phillips-Perron, descriptive statistics, and ordinary least square. As for the diagnostic checking, I'm using the autocorrelation and multicollinearity to test the data. Autocorrelation referring to the lower and upper limit on the values obtained based on the statistics or p-value, while for the multicollinearity, if the VRF value exceeds 10, this means that multicollinearity between the variables is very high and vice versa. Descriptive statistics enable the sample to be simplified and characterized with 30 observations. The table shows a prevalent overview of the descriptive data such as minimum, maximum, mean, median, standard deviation, sample variance, kurtosis, and skewness. When the skewness are range of 0.5 to 1 or more than 1 or range of 0.5 to -1, there is moderate skewness. Meanwhile, if the value of skewness is between 0.5 to -0.5, there is approximately skewness. Based on the table, the unemployment and education indicates high degree of skewness, while the GDP growth and GDP per capita indicates comparatively more symmetry. According to the table, all the variables shows positive kurtosis because all the value is more than 0. Next, with test analysis. Based on the table, the p-value of all parameters are not more than 0.05 at the CI of 95%. The result shows for both level, first and second difference, are significant, which means all the data are stationary. The result of the unit weight indicates that the data can be predictable or has accurate analysis to regress by using OLS. So this is the result of OLS. The R squared is 0.98287, which indicates 98.29% of dependent variable is affected by the independent variables, while other 1.71% is affected by other factors. The adjusted R squared is 0.98098, which means 98.1% of dependent variable is affected by independent variables. Meanwhile, another 1.9% is affected by other factors. Adjusted by degree of freedom, the F statistics is 561.9014, which is greater than the critical value of 2. Therefore, we reject the null hypothesis HO. Next is the discussion related to research objective. Research objective 1 is to identify the relationship between education and GDP growth in Malaysia. The result is when education rate increased by 1%, GDP growth decreased by 6.6%. The p-value is 0.4974, which is greater than 0.05. Hence, do not reject HO. This indicates there is no significant relationship. Research objective 2 is to identify the relationship between GDP per capita growth and GDP growth in Malaysia. The result is when GDP PC growth increased by 1 unit, GDP growth increased by 1.0424 unit. The p-value is 0.0000, which is lower than 0.05. Hence, we reject the HO. This indicates there is significant relationship. Research objective 3 is to identify the relationship between unemployment and GDP growth in Malaysia. The result is when unemployment increased by 1%, the GDP growth increased by 22.38%. The p-value is 0.0106, which is lower than 0.05. Hence, we reject the HO. This indicates there is significant relationship. Move on to the diagnostic checking. Autocorrelation. HO will be no autocorrelation and H1 has autocorrelation. The result is based from the Durbin-Watson test. The result shows that the value of the test is greater than the upper limit value. Hence, do not reject HO. Thus, there is no autocorrelation. Next is multicollinearity. According to the VIF values of independent variables, there is no serious multicollinearity among the variables, as the VIF is less than 10, as stated by Gujarati and Botte. Therefore, null hypothesis is rejected. Thus, there is no multicollinearity problem in the model. This is the summary of the results. The finding shows that there is no relationship between GDP growth and education. While for the unemployment and GDP per capita, it has significant relationship with the GDP growth based on the p-value. Every research and studies has its own limitations of study. As for this limitation of study, all the different data was collected from different sources. In addition, it would be better if the study related to the happiness and its impact towards economic development has more clear study and research. Lastly, the conclusion and recommendation. According to the results of this study, both social, unemployment, and economic, the GDP per capita, factors are the main sources of happiness that drives our economic development in Malaysia. By doing this research, the objective of this study had been achieved, as well as the research question, by getting a result, which is there is an impact of happiness on the economic development in Malaysia. As for the future study, the researchers are hoping that there will be more study on the impact of happiness towards economic development in Malaysia. And that's all from me. Thank you.